Good afternoon. Could I welcome you all to the August meeting of the Planning Committee at City of York Council on the 5th of August 2021. Could I just ask all members to turn off their phones, please? I'll put them onto silent. There are no fire alarms planned, but should anything go off, it will be a real alarm. So if you go through the door in the far corner and congregate outside. I will take a comfort break after 1.5 hours if required, depending on how long the item takes. The toilets, if you need them, are just around the corner. If any member wishes a comfort break at any time, please just put your hand up and I'll be happy to accommodate that. Okay, moving on to the first item agenda, declarations of interest. Do we have any declarations of interest? Councillor Craghill.
Thank you, Chair. In the interest of transparency and in relation to item 4A, I'd like to make it clear that I'm looking at this item with an entirely open mind. I understand a concern has been raised because Councillor Andy Dagon, who is my partner, is speaking on this issue as ward councillor representing his residents. I have had no involvement with the matter in question at item 4A, and I don't believe this constitutes any kind of interest in the same respect as it wouldn't with any other kind of council business where myself and Councillor Dagon operate as independent individuals. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? I should have also mentioned at the start that we have apologies for absence from councillors Eyre, Barker, Dobney and Melly, and Councillor Douglas and Councillor Lomas are self-isolating because members of their household have been pinged by the COVID app, and so they're doing the right thing and staying at home, so we thank them for that. We have also a substitute. Councillor de Gorn is absent, has also offered his apologies and is substituted by Councillor Craghill, as we've just heard. So that clears that little backlog up. Moving on to item 2 on the agenda, which is the minutes of the last meeting of the Planning Committee, which are on pages 3 to 10. That's the 17th of June 2021, that meeting. Is anyone prepared, happy? Are all members happy with that, or do any members have any? Councillor Waters.
It's not a comment on the minutes as such. It was just wanting an update on page 9. The section 106 contribution for tree planting following consultation with the chair and vice chair. I just thought this was the best time to actually ask if there was any update. If not, can we have one next meeting?
Thank you. I think Becky's going to deal with that one.
Yeah, we've looked into it, and unfortunately there are utilities underneath the pavement which wouldn't allow the trees to be planted, but we're just trying to see if there's any other way around it at the moment. But the initial search shows that the utilities wouldn't allow for it. We're just trying to see if there's a different way around, so we're still on with it, but initially it doesn't look possible.
Right, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Waters. Thank you, Becky. Okay, moving on to item 3, public participation. Now, there are no items generally, so therefore we don't need to take that now. I presume we'll take it as part of item 4A. So we have some public speakers then. Okay, we'll move on to the plans list, which the only one item on the agenda today is Frederick House, Fulford Road. If you'd like to introduce it and give us the background, please.
Thank you, Chair. Just by way of an update, condition 9 on your agenda item needs to be removed as it's with regard to archaeology, and that information's already been submitted and agreed with the archaeologist. Okay, I'll just quickly run through the plans for you so you can see it there on the screens. The red line is the site location plan, and then the previously approved site plan that you can see. For ease, remember the blue buildings are the proposed buildings that you can see there, with the yellow one to your left, depending if you're looking at that one, is the retained building. So this is block B, the north and east elevations. Block B, south and west elevations. Again, the elevations of the further blocks C and D. Again, all the elevations, block E and block F there, in the northern elevations. Again. And then this is the landscape layout that you can see that it's been split into 2, so it's easier to see that way, but you can see the proposed landscaping in here. And this is the photograph, as you can see, that the development's on site being built at the moment. So this is block B. Block C, just next to the crane that you can see there. Block D, see the shape of the building there. Block E, block F, block G, and then the view from block F towards the guardhouse. So that's if you stood right at the back of the site where you saw from the virtual visit on Tuesday, back towards the guardhouse. And again, view from the guardhouse to all the way along the site. You just see the trees of the neighbouring properties in there and the boundary there. And then I think that's the brickwork that you can see. That's a close-up of the brickwork, which I'll go into in a minute. And that's the entrance into the site from Fulford Road. As you can see, the existing building to be retained there. And the photograph from the entrance number 2 that you can see. And that's the view from Fulford Road. You can just see at the back there the crane lift that you saw on the other picture. That's it. I'm just going to assist members, just going to run through the actual proposal and what you're considering. So proposal is for a variation of condition. So this isn't the principle of development. Again, this is the variation of condition. And what the variation is with regard to the building height, because there has been some changes. In some sections, the height has been reduced, and in some sections it has been increased. The biggest increase at any point is 30 centimetres. There's also the replacement of the timber cladding on the original approval with brick, hence the picture that I just showed you of the brick. There's also the removal of the Juliet balconies. The relocation of the plant room and the substation have swapped locations due to the access distance of the utilities between the substation. There's then a green roof to substation and plant room. The utility company objected to the inclusion of a green roof above the substation on safety grounds. And as the substation and the plant room structures are proposed to swap, the substation structure is now adjacent to the car park of the public house. The plant room structure will be constructed of a sedum roof and as illustrated on a revised landscaping drawing, and alterations to the landscaping as I showed on that plan. So that, for yours, is what this proposal is for you, in front of you to consider. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much indeed. Do members have any questions to officers? Councillor Warby.
Thank you, Chair. On 1.6 of the report, it says through the detailed design stage, it has become apparent that the parapet heights of the pitched roofs on blocks E, F and G do not allow sufficient height to insulate and waterproof the building. I just want to know what's changed. Why was it approved in the first place? Why does the height need? I don't see. Can you explain it to me, please? Thank you.
As well as I'll try. Since it was approved, it's been developed by somebody else than who originally applied for the proposal, and when they've actually gone to build it, that's where they've come to build it, and there has been a change in these heights through the build process. So from the information that we have, it's just through the build process, and they need to achieve building regulations. It's required the slight uplift in some places, but it's also meant being able to come down in others. Okay.
Councillor Doherty, and then Councillor Pavlovich.
Continuation of the same line of questioning, actually, insofar, would officers agree that this is necessary to keep within building regulations, this increase?
Simple answer is I don't know that, but I think from a planning point of view, that's not something that we can give any weight to, whether or not it complies with building regulations. We've got to consider this in terms of the planning policies in front of us. So from a planning point of view, officers have considered it and consider that it's acceptable, the changes that are there.
Can I just clarify with you, planning and building regulations are completely separate. So there's no, we could not know there was a problem with building regulations when we actually approved it.
Yeah, and it may, as far as I'm aware, we can ask the applicant, but they've not used the local authority building control, they've used an independent building inspector, so it's not something that we'd necessarily be a party to either.
Thank you. Councillor Pavlovich.
Thank you, Chair. Had these revised heights been part of the original application, would it have made any difference to the recommendation to approve that we considered in 2020?
We would have considered it, and I don't think it would have changed the recommendation, given that the height increase is in places 30 centimetres, but it's also been brought down in other places. So I think when you consider the development as a whole, if we'd have considered this scheme in front of us then, it would have still been recommended for approval.
Could I just clarify? The fact is a retrospective application. We have to consider it as if it was ab initio as a first application. We can't take into account any change. The fact that it's a change application, we must consider it as it is presented before us. Is that correct?
Chair, yes. If the question is in respect of, is this, it's retrospective, does that mean that there has been, for example, breach of development control? If that's what's being considered, then yes, you are absolutely right that the planning application has to be considered on its own merits in reference to the local development plan and any of the material considerations, and the fact that this is retrospective is not a material consideration.
Thank you very much indeed. I thought that was the case. Councillor Waters.
Thank you, Chair. I don't know whether my memory's 100% right on this score, so feel free to stop me if I am wrong. But I seem to recall that when we looked at this the first time, that one of the reasons why it was considered for approval was the scheme wasn't detrimental on the conservation area simply because it couldn't really be seen from Fulford Road. Given that there's an increase in height of a foot, 12 inches, presumably it's going to make it more visible from Fulford Road. I'd just like the views of the conservation architect.
Hello, if I try and answer that question, my name is Guy Hanson. I'm the design team leader for design conservation and I'm an architect. Yes, Councillor, I do recall the original application and we did consider the impact on the street scene as being one of the important drivers for an assessment of its impact. And in that respect, the application started out as a 5-storey development and we objected to it as a 5-storey development because it could clearly be seen above the ridges of the resident houses on Kilburn Road, and you could also see it above the pub. And Fulford Road as conservation area is the road itself, rather than Kilburn Street. But the reduction from the 5-storey to the 4-storey did make a massive difference. You can still see it from the street, but you see it in the gaps between the semi-detached houses. And in respect to this change, a change of a foot seen over a distance, if you're standing at the street, of potentially sort of 60 metres or so, I don't think it would make a material difference to that impact on the conservation area.
Does that answer your question, Councillor Warby? Sorry, Waters, sorry, apologies.
For now, but it can't be considered a positive development, can it? Bearing in mind the views that you expressed before, to make it more visible, even if it's just another 12 inches more visible, can't be considered a positive.
Yes, you're correct there. But when the application came to us, as in this application, the proposal just was to increase the height of E, F and G. And at that point, I was objecting to the basis of it wasn't a positive thing. We did negotiate a reduction in height of buildings B, C and D to counter it, so that on balance, I consider the impact to be neutral. So the buildings B, C and D, there was a sort of design device where they slightly staggered the different coloured bricks. And so one of the parapets was higher than it needed to be. And that parapet reduced by 500 millimetres. It becomes a bit difficult to try and make a judgment on the overall balance of things. But I'd say that the impact overall was neutral because of because of that, because the other bits that have gone up is the apex of the roof, which has gone up by a foot. The flat roof sections of the other bits have gone up by, I think, 200 millimetres. And so on balance, I thought it was along the whole street, particularly the impact from the conservation area, which is closer to these other buildings, B, C and D, which have gone down. You know, you could potentially argue that in terms of its impact on the conservation area, it's a very marginal improvement.
I must say, Councillor Waters, we had a site visit. I realise you have money to earn and a job to fulfil. We did look at this when we had the site visit, and I think it was virtually invisible from Fulford Road. The only area it was really visible from in the street scene was between the gaps in the houses on Kilburn Road. So we did look at that at the site visit. So I can reassure you, the impact on Fulford Road is not going to be significantly different. Councillor Warby.
Thank you, Chair. On paragraph 1.11, the utility company objected to the green roof on the substation of grounds of safety. Can you explain, is it safe? And if not, is it getting changed, please?
Yeah, the green roof's been removed because the utility company objected to it. No, it's been taken. No, it's fine. It's because it's been taken off because the utility company didn't want a green roof on it.
Thank you, I'm sorry.
But the plant room is getting a sedum roof.
Yes.
Yes, that's right.
Yes.
So
Yes,
it's been swapped over effectively. Yeah. Councillor Pavlovitz.
Thank you, Chair. I suspect this may be another question for Guy, but also for Becky. The replacement of the timber cladding with brick. How do you consider that to be the impact of that on the overall design of the building? And to Becky, on the same issue, it states public or investor perceptions. There are no grounds that the government, for example, have made in respect to the removal of the timber cladding, have they? On the grounds that this building is too small, too low for mandatory removal of any type of exterior cladding. So if Guy could answer the first one on an aesthetic perspective, and then you on the technical one. Unless you want to answer both.
Thank you, Councillor. In respect to the aesthetics, the timber cladding, there are some very attractively designed timber buildings. It is a bit of a risk when somebody says they're going to build their building in timber. You know, it has a, you know, potentially, you know, it has a lower carbon impact because it's a sustainable material. But in terms of how it will look, some timber buildings can look absolutely terrible after a period of time. You know, they turn into sheds and they look like a big garden shed. Some buildings look really good. And again, that depends on the skills of the architect and how it weathers and whether it weathers inconsistently. So you get stains, sometimes the tannins come out of the timber and you get sort of orangey bits. So it is a little bit of a risk having a timber building. But it can look part of a more humane and particularly in a landscape setting, it can look more attractive if it's done really well. The change aesthetically to brick, you know, I had to consider it on the merits of, you know, would I have objected, you know, returning to your original question, would I have objected to it coming forward as a brick building originally? And I think I wouldn't have been able to insist on it being a timber building. You know, there are a couple of timber buildings at the end of the street. They're new buildings. The majority of the buildings in the neighbourhood are brick, and so you would argue that you know, a brick is a sensible choice. As to which particular brick, the brick that they chose was a brick that sort of emulated what would have been a weathered timber. So it is a sort of greyish brick. Because you know, timber silvers down unless you constantly put treatments on it. And the timber was, in all honesty, originally brought into the picture as part of a sort of mixing up the elevations because they are quite lumpy buildings, and it introduced some visual interest. You know, there wasn't any functional particular difference. It's just another part of the elevation. So we thought that it would probably be sensible, in order to keep that aesthetic, to keep with a different coloured brick rather than go for one of the other bricks.
Councillor Craddock.
Thank you, Chair. Can I just ask, I imagine Becky, the condition 19 is the carbon emission reduction measures. So that's with reference to CC1 and CC2 of the draft local plan. Is that, am I understanding this correctly? Is that a new condition that wasn't on the original permission?
No, it was on the original permission. And then as part of the original permission, they had to submit details to discharge that condition. They've done that. So that condition charge basically ties this application to that information.
Oh, I see.
It's technical planning, but
I see
basically
that, yeah.
they've submitted the information already. We don't want them to resubmit it. So what we're doing is tying this application to the information they've already given us.
I was just
That's
asking
acceptable.
because the increase in height is being linked to insulation in terms of building regs. So I just wondered if we were confident that the height they're now proposing is feasible in the context of CC1 and CC2.
We've already discharged that information and deemed it to be acceptable, yeah.
So that is part of that.
That's what that is, yeah.
Okay, thank you for that. Can I ask a second question, Chair? Was a completely different question, really. I'm sorry I couldn't make the site visit, but I believe that you've shown us images. The building has continued, hasn't it? And much of the building the frame of the building is built. Is that being built now to the higher heights?
Yes.
So it wasn't deemed appropriate to stop the building when it was in contravention of the planning permission?
No.
Can you explain why that is, just so people can understand that?
Yeah, because of the differences, because it, as Guy's been through, because it was actually less in some areas, but slightly more in others. And also because usually in planning terms, if you've got a planning application in, you don't tend to take enforcement action because you have to try and proactively engage to resolve a situation, and the planning application is seen as a way of proactively engage before actually taking enforcement action. So that's why we didn't take action, given the minimal distances, and because the application was in, put them all together, and it wasn't considered reasonable to start taking enforcement action at that point.
So without expressing any view about whether I think 30 centimetres is reasonable or not, because I don't think that's not my point, is that not prejudging this planning hearing today?
No, you've got the MPPF is clear that we should work with applicants where possible, and that's what we were trying to do through this. And as Guy said, he's negotiated where it's been reduced and got to a point where we feel like it's acceptable. So it wouldn't be expedient, well, not expedient, that's the wrong word. It wouldn't be appropriate to take enforcement action given that we were trying to negotiate through the planning process.
Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other members who have questions? If not, then I think we can move on to public participation. And we have 3 speakers tonight. The first one is Mr. David Hopwood, who is a local resident and speaking in objection. So, Mr. Hopwood, if you would like to come and take your seat, you have 3 minutes. And if you could stay in your chair afterwards when you finish, please, in case the members have any questions for you.
It might be a touch over 3 minutes, but I mean a touch. But given the discussions here and the importance of this to the residents, hopefully you will allow me a little bit of an overrun as well. A touch, please.
Since you're the only item on the agenda, I think we can allow you a few seconds extra.
That is very kind.
Just stick to 3 minutes if as close as you can, please.
Yes, thank you. I'm here to represent my 88-year-old father, who's lived on the street for 62 years, and the residents of Kilburn Road. Around 20 months ago, I sat here in the first planning meeting for this development and urged you all to reject the original planning proposal Sadly, despite the huge number of objections, most of the councillors ignored those objections and voted for the planning permission to take place against the wishes of the long-standing York residents. Now the buildings are under construction, it's causing a great deal of noise, dust and stress to all the residents that live behind it. Yet, we're sat here due to the complete incompetence of the building designers. We're facing a real threat of further height increases to some of the buildings as the parapet heights on the pitch roofs were not sufficient to insulate and waterproof the buildings to the correct building regulation standards. If this is the case, then the developers could fix this simply by removing the top floor from each block. Problem solved. It's unacceptable to further increase the building heights, given this will negatively impact the overall outlook view of the people backing onto it. It decreases the level of light and increases the shadows into some lovely gardens, including that of my father. I noticed the images you showed were all from away from Kilburn Road itself. If you took pictures from the residents' gardens, it's a very different view. Having originally gained permission to build these blocks to a particular dimension, the developers are now applying for permission to vary the appearance by exceeding the previously agreed heights for half the blocks. Rather than wait for a decision, it appears they've forged ahead and are building beyond the permitted height anyway, which is totally unacceptable to all the long-suffering residents. And I suggest that by choosing to reword their application, it appears they're trying to hide behind this breach of the building regulations. I do wonder how many of you actually visited Kilburn Road and stood in the back gardens, like in my dad's house and further down the street, just to see how high and intrusive these buildings really are when it's on your back garden. On paper, this only sounds like a minor change, a few centimetres, but if you see how high they really are, I'm certain you would not allow a further extension to any of these heights. I also wanted to raise concerns over the new proposal for the replacement of the timber cladding with bricks. This is also unacceptable. In the original proposals, the developers went to great lengths to highlight the fact that the hardwood timber panels would serve to make the appearance of these buildings less monolithic and unattractive. And the council design team fully supported that, noting that it added to the quality of the design and complements the overall materials palette. We now see the developers trying to use, in my opinion, the tragedy of Grenfell to save money and maintenance by replacing the previously approved design with cheaper, far less attractive bricks. Please bear in mind that planning was approved for all the timber cladding after the Grenfell disaster, so it wasn't an issue then. All the buildings in this development are well under the 18 metres, and then there should not be a building regulation requirement to have to remove what was originally promised as high quality cladding when you approved it 18 months ago. In July 2021, the government responded to independent expert statements on building safety on these developments less than 18 metres and stated that as a government, we are clear that we support the expert advice on positions that the EWS ones should not be needed for buildings less than 18 metres. And that position was supported by the National Fire Chief Council and the Institute of Fire Engineers.
If you could begin to wind up now, Mr.
Yeah, I am. I've got one little bit left. I also wanted to remind the developers and the council that residents of Kilburn Road are very much in favour of the street being granted residential parking and would welcome the developers to pay for any required permits for a considerable period of time as a very small gesture to compensate for the stress, noise, dust and the potential future disruption of noise, light pollution and, dare I say, real risk of devaluation of all the properties that back onto this terrible, monstrous and unnecessary development. So finally, I urge you all here to vote to reject these new applications, as for the residents, enough really is enough. Please support the people who vote for you, the York residents, and who are now relying on you guys to help them. Thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Hopwood. Are there any questions for Mr. Hopwood from members? No. In that case, I thank you for your contribution. I'm sure we'll take your views into account.
Thank you for allowing me to speak.
If we now call our second speaker, who is Ward Councillor, Councillor Andy de Gorn, who is speaking in person as the Ward Councillor.
Thank you. I'm speaking, as you say, as one of the two Fishgate Ward councillors in support of Kilburn Road residents who are rightly angry at the cavalier approach to planning demonstrated by this application. Half a mile away, a council planning officer threatened immediate enforcement action against a cafe owner if they open windows or have more than 2 chairs and a table outside. Yet this development has been allowed to continue construction for 6 months without a decision on this application to increase the height above the consent granted in January 2020. If the ward councillors hadn't called it in for you to consider today, residents would have had no real opportunity whatsoever to question this abuse of process. A rubber stamped approval for all 6 blocks to increase in height would undoubtedly have gone through. And I apologise for adding another meeting in the calendar, but I hope that this does serve as an opportunity for members of the planning committee to ask why we spend such hours debating the finer points of detailed design, listening to residents' concerns over impact on the living environment and so on, if a decisions made can be so lightly disregarded by developers and not responded to by the planning department. It does also raise questions as to how we ensure that this does put down a marker that architects' designs that fail to provide for meeting building regulations will not be entertained in future. As we move to address the climate emergency with increased insulation levels, there could be increasing temptation for developers to seek planning consent for buildings that then have to subsequently be increased in height during construction in order to meet those required insulation levels. Whatever is decided on this application, I would urge City of York Council to exercise greater vigilance and consistency over our planning procedures. And I hope that officers will be able to respond to any questions that may be put by members as to what the consequences would be if they were to reject this, because that clearly is the implication of which should be a clear option for members before them today.
Thank you very much indeed, Councillor de Gaulle. Have members any questions for Councillor de Gaulle? No, in that case, I'll thank you for your contribution, and your views will undoubtedly be taken into account by members. Thank you. If I can now ask our third public speaker, who is Mr. Ben Wrighton, who is the applicant. Now, I believe he's dialing in, so.
Hi, yes, can you hear me okay?
Thank you very much, we can.
Lovely, okay, thank you, and thanks, Chair, thanks for allowing me to speak this afternoon. I'm Ben Wrighton from Watkin Jones, the applicant for the scheme. The site was granted, as you've heard, planning permission back in May 2020, and it was designed and negotiated by the previous site owner, Summix. Following this decision, Watkin Jones acquired the site with the commitment to deliver the accommodation for July next year, for the start of the academic year. During our review of the technical design, it became apparent that amendments to the ex-ante permission were required to positively address fire risk, climate change measures, and the biodiversity enhancements. And these have formed the basis for this planning application. Since September last year, and throughout the build, we've been discussing the nature of the necessary amendments with your case officer and the council's design and sustainability manager and the landscape officer. We've listened, and where necessary, we've responded to make further changes to the scheme. With regard to the height of the scheme, the proposals allow for a very modest increase in the overall height of 2 of the 6 buildings to the east, furthest from the conservation area, to allow compliance with the new building regulations. This is roughly equivalent to 2 regular brick courses, or it's a 2% increase in the overall, in the permitted height for those 2 blocks to the east. Heights have been adjusted and reduced elsewhere. We acknowledge it was a key challenge to the ex-ante permission, and we looked at a number of alternative options before pursuing the proposals. For example, reducing parapet heights, but they would change the pitch of the roof, which officers felt wouldn't have a good appearance. And alternatively lowering the buildings, which would lead to problems for drainage and level thresholds for disabled access. So therefore, it was agreed with their officers that the only viable solution to accommodate these important changes were increases to the heights, overall heights of buildings F and G to the east, whilst reducing step up to the parapets closest to the conservation areas as mitigation. In terms of the change to the external materials, the proposal seeks to remove the consented timber cladding. As noted, this has been driven by industry-wide perceptions of flammable building materials on residential buildings. The alternative masonry design and colour allows for a variety in the appearance of the buildings, and again has been supported by the design and sustainability manager, and is certainly not a cheaper option. With regard to landscape, the application proposed an extension of the important access road for emergency access, and following consultation with your landscape officer, we've increased areas of soft landscaping and wildflower planting. So in summary, we've made proposed changes to enhance biodiversity, address fire risk and climate change matters. The effects of these necessary changes have been minimised as far as possible, and all potential effects have been assessed. Alternative designs have been considered and discounted with your officers, and the proposals therefore offer important benefits with no adverse effects as a result of the changes to design. The principle of student accommodation is not for here today, and therefore the proposals accord with the NPPF and the draft policies of your plan. There's no other material considerations or evidence presented to the council to suggest that refusal could be reasonably advanced by the committee. So we therefore fully support your officer's recommendation and look forward to completing this investment. Thank you.
Thank you. If I could just ask you to stay online so that any members can put any points to you. Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned that you'd considered lowering the building, but said that would cause problems for, I think you said, drainage and disabled access. Can I just be clear, when you say you considered lowering the building, are you talking about the removal of a storey, or keeping the same number of stories but sinking, sort of setting the building at a lower level, in effect making it the ground floor part sunken? I just wondered if you could explain a bit more what options you did explore and why they proved to be not options that you have pursued.
Yeah, sure. I'll explain as far as I can. No, the reduction in height in terms of changing the ground floor level, so effectively taking the building further down into the ground, was considered.
Is that supplementary, Councillor Benson?
So, well, that's fine. So am I right in thinking, therefore, that you did not consider removing one of the stories from the blocks that you have actually built to a height greater than that you had permission for?
Yeah, that's correct. We didn't consider taking out a whole floor of accommodation. No.
Thank you, Councillor Pavlovitz.
Thank you, Chair. You mentioned in the context of current industry issues with flammable building facade materials, this is in relation to the timber cladding. When this came to this committee, and I was on that committee at the time, great store was made by the benefits from a design perspective and an aesthetic perspective of the timber cladding. Surely the same industry concerns existed then, but it was used, the timber cladding was used as a selling feature. Can you explain to us why you've decided to take it out now?
Yeah, just to be clear, sorry, we weren't involved with the previous planning application. We weren't in attendance at the committee. We weren't involved with the site at all at that time. So I can't really comment on what was said at the time. So as we've sort of set out, there is very much a view that even on smaller buildings, some investors do not like timber cladding or flammable materials on buildings. And as your officer pointed out, conservation officer, it wasn't deemed to be so important to protecting the character and appearance of the conservation area. And so we worked with your officers to consider an alternative solution, which was masonry, which is reflective of the local area and the conservation area. There really isn't that many timber buildings or timber clad buildings in the area. So the brick solution with the sort of detailing that we've offered, it felt like a very suitable alternative, which has as good a qualities as timber.
Thank you, Councillor Craggill. Yes.
Yes, just following up on this question of the timber cladding. I think I heard you say that removing the timber cladding and replacing it with brick isn't the cheaper option, but I am aware that the price of timber has increased significantly for construction has increased significantly recently, and is expected to stay a bit high for a while. So can you just clarify, is that, if that is part of your consideration, or are you actually saying that it will be more expensive to use brick than to use timber?
Yeah, so the move is made primarily for fire risk considerations. So the cost between the two materials is insignificant, because the quantity of material is pretty insignificant on the scale of this scheme. So it's primarily for fire considerations.
So, but you think it will cost you a bit more to use brick than to use timber?
No different, no significant difference.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other members? Councillor Pavlik.
Thank you. Sorry, I just need to go back to my original question in relation to the timber cladding and your response. You stated that investors, and I'm paraphrasing now, investors get a bit twitchy when there's timber cladding involved. So is this in context, not of design, but of making it an easier prospect to sell?
Well, look, the design's important. Clearly, we're very aware that this is a sensitive area with the conservation area as well. So we've been in discussions with the officers to understand whether or not it's the sort of building and location that can accommodate these sorts of changes. I haven't been imparted to all the conversations, so I couldn't say exactly who said what about timber, but it's a perfectly reasonable amendment to the scheme in character and design terms. So I think hopefully that in part answers your question.
It clearly, do you want to come back on anything on that, Councillor Pavlik, or?
Sorry, that didn't answer my question in the slightest. My question was, is this a design change? And I just want to challenge, we've already heard that there are two timber buildings at the end of that road. You did say that there weren't many timber buildings in the vicinity. Well, there are two within a stone's throw of the building. But my question to you was, is this design change in respect of the commercial element of it rather than any aesthetic design element of it? And that's the bit you studiously avoided answering.
So this is about making sure it's good quality design. So as I've said before, we've been negotiating the design changes with the officers to make sure it's a scheme which is fits in well with the character of the area. And yes, you can pick out a couple of buildings which have timber, but there's an awful lot of brickwork in the area as well, and that's a character of the conservation area. So we feel this is a good response. It still offers a variety of elevational treatment. In terms of the perception of timber on buildings, I mean, hopefully everyone's aware that that is something that has moved on over time. Now, I can't comment why it didn't come into consideration with the previous applicant and the previous scheme that's been put in here, but time has moved on, and there is perceptions across the property development industry and occupiers that timber use on buildings is not always appropriate, and therefore it's a risk that we would like to remove. And we think that the alternative option of the brickwork is absolutely supportable in policy design terms, and that's really what we're talking about here for the detail of this decision.
Councillor Walters.
Thank you, Chair. You said in your 3 minutes that you first became aware that there was going to be a problem as regards the height last September. Was that correct, my reading of that?
I think so. I might have to call on colleagues who are involved with the actual build of the project if you need that level of detail.
I'm just curious as to, having realised that there was going to be a problem with the finished height, that you just pressed on and built the top floor. Wouldn't it have been sensible to have paused on that level of building until this was resolved?
Maybe I can add to this. My name is Jonathan Morris. I'm the Senior Design Manager for Watkin Jones, overseeing the development. I've also got on the call Matt Proctor, who's the architect. When we started with the design development of this, what we have done is reduced the ceiling voids within the development to accommodate as much as we could and retain within the consented heights. But by the time that we'd actually got to the detailing of the actual the roof itself and the roof structure, including the parapets of blocks F and G, it was noted by the architect that to achieve the U values required, we needed to essentially heighten the building by a couple of courses of brickwork to allow the detail to be compliant to building control and to prevent ingress into the building. At which point, we were already in discussions with Tim, the case officer, and Guy in respect to discharging conditions relating to materials and other conditions in the consented scheme, and we raised this issue with them almost straight away, so quite openly, and for transparency. We were looking at the details with them, and it's unfortunate that at that point, that there was basically there was very little options or opportunities to actually reduce or change without impacting the scheme in a more negative way. I think we touched on it earlier that we did consider with Guy reducing the pitch of the gables in order to bring the height down. I think Guy was of the position that same as us, that that would have a more negative effect and appearance. So that it was decided then that we would keep the pitches of the gable ends as they were consented, and then look to reduce the parapets in other areas to mitigate the impact of the slight increase that we were having to do. I'm not sure if Matt, you could jump in if you on a technical basis as to.
Could I just intervene there and say that we've taken legal advice, and this is not actually a planning consideration. We are here to determine this application. We're not here to look into the history of how this application came about. Would you agree that's the right?
Yes, Chair. As I think you invited me to comment at the outset of the meeting, that breaches of planning control or alleged breaches of planning control cannot be a material consideration. There is High Court case law to that effect, which says that they're not material planning considerations when you are making your planning judgment, and that this planning application, as a matter of law, has to be considered on its own merits with reference to the local development plan, any other material considerations. And just to remind members that what you are considering is the impact of the proposed amendments on the conservation area, etc., set out in the report. This is an application, as the committee report says on page 17. This is an application under section 73 of the Planning Act, and I'm just scrolling down, and it says, section 73 says that on such an application, the local planning authority shall only consider the question of the conditions subject to which planning permission should be granted. So as Becky said at the outset, you're just considering the impact of the proposed amendments. Hope that assists.
Thank you very much. Yes. Councillor Waters. Yep.
Thank you, Chair. Well, just to clarify, there was one point made there that I think we all realise the local authority's got a statutory duty to consider the impacts on conservation areas. We've also got a duty to consider the impacts on neighbouring amenity, for want of a better word, on Kilburn Road.
That is correct. Are there any further questions from members? Councillor Doughty.
Just on the topic of neighbouring amenity, the previous speaker obviously expressed disappointment at the further increase in height and the inconvenience caused to residents on Kilburn Road as part of the development that's ongoing, and suggested that it might be appropriate for a contribution to be made towards a res parking scheme for the residents that live along there. Now, we appreciate this is not something that could be conditioned as part of the planning application, but is this something that Watkin Jones will be prepared to do as a goodwill gesture for the residents?
Is that a question for Watkin Jones?
Yes, please.
I don't think that would be a reasonable request in planning terms, to be honest. I think maybe your legal advisor needs to advise you on that.
Yeah, Chair, I mean, I do agree that with the applicant that that issue of a voluntary payment is not relevant. I don't think that it can be said that relates to the impact of the proposed amendments. All that can be considered are the conditions, as I said just now. Section 73 of the Act says that you shall only consider the question of the conditions subject to which planning permission should be granted. I don't see how that proposed payment relates to the impact of the changes that are being proposed to the conditions.
No, I agree that if that was going to be brought up, it should have been brought up at the initial planning meeting when it was approved. But thank you. Any further questions? I have one or two, possibly two. You said that the cladding is flammable. How flammable is larch cladding compared to the aluminium plastic core cladding that was in use on the Grenfell town, which was the prime cause of the tragedy at that location?
Can I ask either Jonathan or Matt, the architect, to maybe give a view on the flammability, please?
Yeah, maybe I could jump in here. Well, both would be flammable. In buildings over 18 meters now, it's it's basically nothing flammable is permitted. So again, going back to perceptions, yes, there's different materials of different rates of flammability, but at the end of the day, the perception is that it is flammable. Unfortunately, I've got no technical information here to make that comparison at this point.
My understanding is that larch cladding is not self-sustaining. Once it's caught fire, it rapidly goes out unless there's another source of heat. Whereas the aluminium plastic cladding at Grenfell, their core actually melted, ignited the aluminium, and that was the main cause of it. So I think there's a little bit of a difference in the two types of cladding. The second question is, this building is only sort of 13 meters high, and the government is not seemingly concerned about cladding on buildings under 18 meters because they're not paying for people to have it removed under that height. So could you comment on that, please?
That's correct. We are below 18 meters. But as we presented, this is more to do with the perception of anyone, well, the investors, but also the students, the parents of the students. Even we've had schemes in the past where people are concerned as to where they put their children when they go to university, and are consciously making decisions based on materials used in the buildings.
Thank you. Are there any further questions from members? Nope, there are no further questions. So, Mr. Wright and team, if I could thank you for your contributions, and I'm sure we'll use your information to inform our decision. Okay, are there any further questions to officers as a result of that? Councillor Pavlovich.
Thank you. And in the light of our legal advisor's comments earlier, can I just clarify that what is a material consideration that we have to take into account is the removal of the timber cladding, yes, and the increase in height. So those are both within our responsibility to consider whether we agree with them or whether we don't agree with them.
Yes.
Marvellous.
Councillor Craghill.
Yes, apologies if this is fully explained in here, but I'd just like to clarify, just in terms of the increase in height of those specific buildings, and their impact on the amenity of the homes that are close to them on Kilburn Road. I think the speaker mentioned additional overshadowing. I just wondered if you could clarify the details of that and the extent of the difference that it makes.
Yeah, the increase is on block E, F and G. So if you can see on your screen, it's the ones, hang on, which way are you looking at it? To your right, so the three to your right, if you're looking at it that way, three to your left, if you're looking at it that way, depending which way you're looking at it. So it's there that there is an increase. The maximum increase is 30 centimetres. And given the distance from the neighbouring properties of those blocks, we've considered it as a round, and we still think that it's acceptable in terms of the impact on the amenity of the neighbouring properties, given the distance and given the height.
So will there be a bit, however much, of extra overshadowing in the gardens, or will it reach the houses?
Could I perhaps take that on, because I've done some calculations on that?
Yeah,
I spent quite a lot yesterday doing calculations. The building that's 12 metres at a distance of about 45 metres will have an actual elevation above the skyline of 16.7 degrees, which means that with the sun at midwinter solstice will be an elevation of 13 degrees in York. And what that means is that the sun will not rise above the level of the buildings in midwinter, but that is at the base of the adjoining wall of the house. So it will effectively block out all light to the direct light, sunlight to the garden. And it will do so for approximately 3 weeks on either side of that solstice. There'll be no direct sunlight into the back garden of the house. The 13-metre one, it will be about 4 weeks. But I did some calculations for the original Frederick house, and that would have also blocked it out for about 2 weeks. It would not, however, block light to the windows in the house, in the habitable rooms. I did a calculation on that as well. It will always allow sunlight to enter the habitable rooms of the house. Hope that helps.
Yeah, very detailed. Thank you.
I did astronomy at university.
I really think we should, we should be able to have that information, really. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Councillor Pavlovitz. Yep, sorry.
Last question from me, Chair. Guy, the pitch of the roof. We heard from the applicant that you agreed that the height pitches would be a negative, to change them, to reduce them or increase them. I can't remember what it was. Would be a negative. Is that right? Is that what you agreed? Always worth checking on these things.
Yes, it is. In the context of I was seeking alternative solutions, which was the reduction of the parapet elsewhere. The pitches themselves, I mean, if it's worth briefly talking about the design rationale for the whole scheme, these 3 buildings are quite higgledy-piggledy. They're more sort of compared to the other 3 buildings, which are more regular. The other 3 buildings relate more to the shape of the previous office building. These were thought to be slightly different, near the sort of woody end of the building and more in the woods, more domestically shaped. Their footprint is more staggered. 2 out of the 3 are also townhouse types, so they're not actually blocks of flats; they are houses, sort of townhouse types. And having their own identity was considered important originally. And so part of that identity, it includes the pitches of the roofs. The pitches already are quite shallow. It's not a steeply pitched roof. If it was a steeply pitched roof, I'd say yes, just make it a bit more shallow, but they are quite low. And to actually drop it even further, you end up with a very strange roof that sort of is pitched in name, but it's just a bit strange looking. And so I was seeking alternative ways of mitigating the overall impact across the whole development, which was lowering the parapet.
Are there any of the members with questions? Time. 5:30. So I think we're okay to move into debate. I think we can, unless any member would like to break, I don't think. Nope, we'll get on and have a debate then. Right. Right. Any members like to start debate? Councillor Waters.
Thank you, Chair. Well, I was dead against the original approval, largely because I can never forget being told that the only reason that this whole scheme was acceptable was the fact that you couldn't see it from Fulford Road, and it really stood out in my mind. But again, that's the statutory duty of the local authorities to consider the conservation area. But the real impact of this always was on the York Council tax-paying residents on Kilburn Road. And if this goes up 12-inch higher, it's going to have another significant detrimental impact on those residents. Personally, I'm all in favour of removal of the cladding from the development and continuation of brick. I'm all in favour of removal of the Juliet balconies, but I'm certainly not in favour of this going any higher, full stop. And we ought to be sending out a clear marker, bearing in mind the number of other flats and such like that's been approved recently, that as a local authority, we're not going to stand for this. Because where does it end? 12-inch higher, 18-inch higher, 2 foot higher? It's just going to go on and on and on. So I'm moving refusal on those grounds.
Okay. Councillor Looker.
Thank you. I don't have the privilege of being here for the original application, but I know quite clearly, looking at it and looking at the details that we have seen today, I would have joined Councillor Waters in opposing it, because for me, it isn't Fulford Road that's the hugely important area to think about. It is the residents in Kilburn Road. People driving up and down Fulford Road will barely register that this is there. And if they do, it will take them 30 seconds as they creep past in one of Fulford Road's traffic congestion. But the people in Kilburn Road are going to live with it day in, day out. And I think it's a very, I mean, if I could have my time again, I would join Councillor Waters in opposing the original application. But if we are treating it as if it were the original application, then I cannot see any reason for approving it. I think it is taking it that bit too high. I think it is taking away perhaps some of the very, very marginal things that might have made the building slightly more livable with. But Kilburn Road is going to take the brunt of this. Fulford Road is hardly going to notice it at all. And it is the residents of Kilburn Road. I'm very grateful to Andy de Gorn, Councillor de Gorn, for bringing it back to the committee, because I think it is important that we should say that our local residents do have some vestigial rights. Kilburn Road may not be a conservation area, but there are people who are living there and have enjoyed the amenity of living there for a very long time. And I think this whole development is going to spoil that amenity. And I think taking it higher and removing perhaps one of the few little extras that might have added to the aesthetics of the design, they're both detrimental. So I will second Councillor Waters' proposal to refuse, and I will certainly be voting that way myself.
Councillor Fenton.
Thank you, Chair. It's been interesting to hear about the process that seems to have transpired since the current developers of the site realised that that there was an issue, and I think and we've heard about an overall neutral impact, because to make up for the increase in the height of some of the blocks, the height of some of the other blocks have been reduced, and I find it a real struggle to see how that helps at all. Whereas you can mathematically you can say yes, the the overall height of the complex is unchanged, but it doesn't detract from the material impact on the residents that live nearest to the blocks that it is proposed and indeed have been built at a higher level. So that's really the issue that I'm grappling with in terms of impact, and I'm not convinced by the the argument around reducing the heights of some blocks somehow makes up for the increase in height and the impact on residents that live closest to those blocks.
Thank you, Chair. I also was at the last planning committee when this was considered, and also had significant concerns about it. And I understand it was passed, and we are therefore where we are, and that people may look askance at where having a debate about 20 centimetres or 30 centimetres. But there are other issues at play here in respect of, and this is why I did check, were the issues like the timber cladding a material concern, and they are. And although Councillor Waters' view was that he would like them to go, I disagree. I felt that one of the few saving graces of the scheme as approved was the fact that the wood effect, the timber cladding, would have some breakup of what is yet another set of big square boxes that we historically approve in this city. And so for me, that would be the grounds in which I would be supporting Councillor Waters and Councillor Looker's proposition of refusing this.
Thank you. I'm going to say a few words now. I've looked at this in considerable detail. I've analysed the effect on the neighbours. We have to have some consistency. About a year and a half ago, we approved a 9.8 metre high building in Strensall, right next to two bungalows. It was 58 metres long. It was 40 metres wide. It completely blotted out not just the light to the gardens, but to most of the house for most of the year. This is 40 metres away, and I cannot see that we will win appeal, because it will go to appeal. I cannot see conceivably that we'll win an appeal on the amenity to the residents of Kilburn Road for a building that is 13 metres high, maximum 40 metres away. I just don't see it, and I think if we go down the line of refusal, we'll be landing this council in a real mess. I shall certainly not support refusal. I would have supported refusal on the grounds of the timber cladding. Perhaps I could have been agreed on that, but I think that would be a matter for the applicants to perhaps, if we were going to refuse it on those grounds, I think we should defer it and allow the applicants to reconsider that bit. But I certainly won't be opposing it on the grounds of the immediate residents in Kilburn Road, because it's too far away. We would not, if they brought a BRE light survey in, it would, and did analysis on the back gardens of Kilburn Road and the habitable part of Kilburn Road, we would not win it under any circumstances. And that is a warning from me, because I think we're treading on dangerous ground. Any other members have got points to make? If there are no further members wish to speak, I think we'll move to the vote. We have it moved by Councillor Waters and seconded by Councillor Looker. Sorry, you could clarify something.
I just want to clarify exactly what you are voting for refusal on. So you voting to refuse it on the impact of the neighbouring properties due to the increase in height. That's your proposal, Councillor Waters.
Yeah.
Obviously word it in a planning reason, but that's the gist of it is due to the increase in size, the proposal will have a detrimental impact on the amenity of the neighbouring properties. That's what you're wanting it to say.
Yeah, but you could also add that it's bound to have some form of the increased detrimental impact on the conservation area, even though in the officer's opinion, that impact is neutral. We're allowed to take the contrary view. It's 12 inches higher, so it's bound to be 12 inches more visible from Fulford Road conservation area.
Okay, that's fine, but my advice to you is if you want to try and defend something at appeal, I would stick to your original reason for refusal about the impact on the neighbouring properties. Given the advice that you've had from our conservation team that specifically says that there will be a neutral impact, I would have seriously concerns of trying to defend that on appeal. The other bit about the impact on the neighbouring properties amenity and your concerns about that, we can put that forward as a reason for refusal that could be defendable. I have seriously, that's my advice, and if you, I understand you don't have to take it, but that's what I would be saying, advising you at this point in time.
Again, I just refer back to the original determination of the application in whenever it was, May 2020, and that quite damning paragraph where the conservation architect stated that the only reason that this was acceptable in planning terms was it couldn't be seen. The fact that it's going to be 12-inch higher makes it more visible. But I'm quite happy to take your advice, and we'll just stick to the amenity of neighbouring residents on Kilburn Road, which I think if any independently minded person actually went down Kilburn Road and saw the horrendous impact, they would realise what we're talking about here.
Okay, are you happy for us to
Thank
move to
you,
the vote now?
Councillor Waters, I've got that, and I thank you for taking my advice, I'd say.
Thank you. Okay, we have a refusal moved by Councillor Waters and seconded by Councillor Looker. Could I ask all those in favour of refusal to please show now? And all those against? 4. So that is refused. Could I ask that my vote in opposition to that motion be recorded in the minutes, please? Thank you. Right, so that seems to conclude the business for tonight. So I'll just thank you all for your attendance. There's no urgent business, so I'll thank you for your attendance and wish you a safe journey home.